Well, here we are again. Another super popular and highly requested matchup for a character that's already been on Death Battle once before, but their previous episode was kind of mid the first time around, and as a bonus, a very highly requested Nintendo franchise finally gets its debut on this show. Which I totally called, by the way. I knew Death Battle was going to do a Fire Emblem matchup this year at some point. I just predicted the wrong one. Though, if you ask me, I think Guts vs. Dimitri is a bit more hype than Zelda vs. Lucina, but that might just be me. But all joking aside, I was honestly pretty excited for this episode. Mainly because of the insane hype around it surrounding the community, and the fact that it was an episode that absolutely deserved to happen. While I do prefer Claire from Claymore as my favorite opponent for Guts, I don't know enough about the character of Guts to fight for it or be super disappointed or upset that they picked Dimitri over her. Besides, I think in terms of an actual death battle, this makes more sense. Mainly just because there's a lot more going on and the way that they take advantage over certain connective traits between the two characters during the fight. It's really something else entirely. But I'm getting ahead of myself. While I'm not a fan of either franchise, I am glad that this episode exists because, let's be honest, Guts deserved a run back after his last episode. Plus, like I said before, Fire Emblem, similarly to Hunter x Hunter from earlier this year, is long overdue for an episode. But I've been rambling for a bit too long. Let's get into the actual episode. As someone who knew very little about the titular characters, I went into this fight excited to learn about them, and I gotta say, they covered their history really well from an outside perspective. With Guts, I was specifically happy how they managed to cover his story really well while also not going too heavily into the spoilers. They managed to balance story and feat coverage beautifully. They mainly go over the story and only really cover the feat stuff when it comes up appropriately. Same with Dimitri's, it's done really well. The editing is also really good, as per usual. I liked Boomstick struggling to lift the Dragon Slayer sword, and I liked Wiz, Boomstick, and Jocelyn arguing over which Fire Emblem house they liked. It gave me flashbacks to when Pokemon Go was super popular and everyone was arguing over which team they chose, or I think it was districts. And I liked how they emphasized how their friends and comrades brought them back from the dangerous and toxic and destructive path that they were walking down, as well as their inner demons egging them on to push them over the edge and succumb to their inner darkness. It was cool to see them emphasize these aspects of their characters since it's one of the main connective traits between the two. And they play to it even more in the fight, but we'll get there. And by get there, I mean we're getting to it right now because I don't really have much else to say about the rundown. They were good, though I do think it would have been funny if they found a way to implement the iconic line of
"This is what Guts does every single day"
from Guts vs. Nightmare. But I can understand if they either didn't think of it or couldn't find a way to implement it into the episode somehow. Anyways, let's move on to the fight itself. The fight is honestly amazing. But before I start digging into this thing, and the things that I like, there are a few things that I want to point out that bugged me a bit. Nothing too major, but they did take me out of the fight, at least for a little bit. Firstly, I'm not really a fan of how the fight starts. The fight opens up with them already in mid-combat, and I thought it was a bit weird and kind of lazy. Though it's not nearly as jarring as the opening to, say, Mechagodzilla vs. Dragonzord, and it's better than not having any kind of proper setup at all, like Madara vs. Aizen, where they just kind of walk up to each other and start fighting. Plus, instead of immediately jumping into the action, like with Mecha vs. Dragonzord, they separate for a moment to have a quick interaction, then jump back into the fight. So it's not that bad, but it is something that kind of bothered me initially. Secondly, the models clash quite a bit. Between Guts' dark and heavily shaded model and Dimitri's very bright and more vibrant model, they look kind of weird when they're directly next to each other. Thankfully, the fight is shot in a way where it's not super distracting, but there are a few shots where they look kind of weird together, like when Dimitri has Guts pinned up against the tree and he's kind of yelling in his face. Thirdly, there are a few instances where the animation, specifically the arms, look a bit jank. They aren't too noticeable unless you're really looking for it, but there are a few shots where the arms look a bit weird to me. And lastly, I'm not really a fan of the way Guts' voice is portrayed. Don't get me wrong, Xander Mobus does play the character really well, and he gets some really good lines in. The man is insanely talented after all. I mean, he was Joker and Master Hand and all these sorts of crazy characters. But the voice that he puts on for Guts is more reminiscent of Wolverine instead of Guts to me, which I guess makes sense since Mr. Mobus played Wolverine in Wolverine vs. Raiden back in the day. I've never read Berserk, nor have I seen any of the anime series made about it, but I always imagined Guts having more of a low, baritone voice with a little bit of gruff to it. Not really this low, heavily gruff and rough voice that Xander puts on for him. Again, Xander plays this portrayal well, but it's not really the direction I'd go for a Guts voice personally. On the topic of voice actors though, Kevin Rivera plays Dimitri very well, and is able to swap between noble and borderline insane in his deliveries surprisingly well, and gets basically all of the good lines in the fight, in my opinion. Anyways, putting those filthy negatives aside, let's move on to the good parts, shall we? Which is basically the entire rest of the episode, because there's plenty to love. Firstly, as per usual with modern Death Battle, the choreography and visuals all look stunning. All of Dimitri's magic spells look really cool and pretty, and he gets to use them in interesting ways. In fact, I'm surprised how much of their arsenal they were able to fit in this fight at all. Dimitri gets to use most of, if not all of his magic, and Guts gets to use all of his cool little gizmos like his bombs, his crossbow, and throwing knives, which, to be honest, Guts throwing spike bombs at Dimitri and pulling the trigger with his mouth while telling him to go to hell is honestly one of my favorite bits from the fight. It is a completely raw shot and perfectly in character for Guts, I assume anyway. Unfortunately, I know very little about both of these franchises, so I'm sorry for anyone who was looking forward to a big deep dive into each character and the Easter eggs that this fight is littered with. Though this episode did get me interested in checking out both franchises. Even though I was already kind of interested in checking out both franchises anyway, this just kind of sped up that process of me maybe checking it out in the future. So maybe when I do check it out in the future, inevitably, I'll grow to appreciate this episode more after I've checked out both series and kind of understand the little references and stuff. But moving back to the fight, the choreography is honestly really good, and there's a lot of interesting exchanges throughout the fight. As an overall thing, I love how Guts is animated. The way he moves and swings his sword really does feel like he's swinging around a giant slab of pure metal, or however it's described. It feels less like he's swinging and stabbing and more like he's just hauling it with all of his strength, which I think is a really cool detail. Dimitri, on the other hand, is moving much more quick and nimble, since his weapon and overall equip load is a lot lighter. So he's swinging his weapon around a lot quicker than Guts and kind of moving around him in a way. Again, it's a cool attention to detail and kind of shows a difference in their fighting styles. As for specific moments, Guts spinning Dimitri around with his sword strike like he's fighting Bowser in Mario 64 I found to be neat and kind of funny. I love this shot of Guts dodging all the lightning bolts Dimitri summoned. Dimitri pinning Guts to the tree and going into his whole thing about revenge, only for Guts to headbutt him, was really good and got a bit of a chuckle out of me. And I like Dimitri using his lightning to stun Guts to give him an opening for his ice magic. I already mentioned the bomb scene and how much I love it, but I also love the little smirk Guts gives before setting off his bombs. Felt very in character, I think. I don't know. But enough about that, because I need to get to the best part about this fight, which is the climax. After both of them have been whittled down, both of them are tempted by their inner demons and give in to them for a brief moment, mixing both of their iconic lines together with both actors giving amazing deliveries that sent chills down my spine.
Promise, I'll kill them, all of them, down to the last one!
It's honestly my favorite scene of the fight, and up there is one of the best scenes in the season so far. No question. The final fight with both of them in their quote-unquote super form, so to speak, is really cool, with both of them fighting no holds barred with their blood constantly being spilled, but them just powering through without a care in the world. And I know I knocked some of the shots from earlier in the fight, but the animation throughout this entire last bit is really crisp and very cinematic, with great movement and great angles and whatnot. Dimitri breaking Guts' mask genuinely caught me off guard for some reason, because I didn't even know that was something you could do with a Berserker armor. Now, here comes my last big gripe of the fight, unfortunately. The killing move for Dimitri honestly felt pretty weak. I get the reference to Fire Emblem with the cool cinematic and whatnot and the big finishing move or whatever it's called, which I did like and appreciate, but the actual killing move felt weak. The shot right before he stabs Guts is really cool, but I didn't really like everything after that. He just kinda stabs Guts and then they both go falling into the ground without any sense of real impact. Then the dust kicks up and that's it, he's just down. For a fight that was really good at displaying violence and the impact of moves, and I guess the gory nature that are associated with these two, it felt kind of disappointing that the last real blow of the fight felt that weak. But thankfully, everything afterwards made up for it in spades, so I'm willing to kind of let that slide because everything that comes after this is honestly amazing. Guts gets up in a shot that genuinely made me believe that they were going to do a big turnaround and have Guts win, only to psych us out at the last minute. It was genuinely a really cool double fake out. And the fact that they decided to pay respect to Guts and Berserk as a whole by not only having Guts die standing up like an absolute boss, pushing forward and past his physical limits to the very bitter end, but Dimitri respecting the man so much that he made the decision to kill demons for him. Dimitri's final line was also really good, and the kind of mixing between nobility and insanity with his final "you shall not have his soul" line was really well delivered, and I always like it when the winner in a fight is able to pay respect to the loser in a way. The final shot of the animation is also really good. Genuinely love shots like this where characters are silhouetted by a full moon. It's one of the reasons why Cloud vs. Link is one of my favorite shots in the entire series. And that's Guts vs. Dimitri, a very highly anticipated episode, and if the fan reception is anything to go by, it did not disappoint by any stretch of the word. I may not have gotten as much enjoyment out of it as others did, mainly due to my lack of investment in the characters, but the fact that this episode came out and immediately became instantly loved by the general community is really nice to see. And I'm really happy that people were able to get this much enjoyment out of an episode. Some people are saying that it's their favorite of the season and their overall one of their favorite death battle episodes, which is awesome. Even if I didn't have as much to say about it as others undoubtedly do, though granted at this point this recording is going to be longer than my Vader vs. Obito review, but that's besides the point. I still really enjoyed this episode as an outsider to both franchises. And who knows, maybe someday I'll go and read Berserk and play Three Houses, and after that I'll gain even more of an appreciation of this episode, despite some of the flaws that I noticed with it. If I had to say one more thing, I do think that Guts gets admittedly less cool lines than Dimitri. Dimitri, in my opinion, I noticed got a lot more cool lines than Guts. Guts obviously gets his cool moments throughout the fight, but I wish they gave him one or two more cool one-liners just to balance it out, I guess. But it's not really that big of a deal, because he still gets a lot to do throughout the episode. But overall, I'd say this episode is a solid 9 out of 10. Definitely better than the majority of the season by a significant margin, except for maybe Rocket vs. Stitch, depending on who you're talking to. But nowhere close, in my opinion, to reaching the heights of Vader vs. Obito or even Chosen Undead vs. the Dragonborn. Though that's probably because of my own personal biases towards the franchises in question. But that also doesn't mean I think this episode is objectively worse than those two episodes, it's just episodes that I prefer a lot more for a variety of reasons. For example, I think Chosen Born has a better track, I think it has cooler effects, and for Vader vs. Obito, I think it's just... Look, there's not much that can top Vader vs. Obito, in my opinion anyway. Also, since we're closing in on the season's halfway point, here's my current ranking of all the episodes so far. Also, just because some of these episodes are at the lowest doesn't mean they're bad. In my opinion, there hasn't really been a singular bad episode in this entire season so far. Though this will most definitely change as more episodes come out. But as for right now, this is what I have. And as for next time, oh boy, this one's a bit complicated. At first, I was pretty disappointed and a bit upset about this matchup, not only because it's another Marvel vs. DC fight, but it's a Marvel vs. DC matchup that's coming out an episode after a different Marvel vs. DC matchup had already come out. I'm not against the matchup itself or the characters involved, really. I actually really like Martian Manhunter and a lot of the stuff I've seen him in. And while I don't know as much about Silver Surfer, or anything at all about him really, besides the fact that he is on a surfboard and he worked for Galactus, I guess, he seems like a cool character that probably doesn't get as much mainstream attention as he probably deserves. Unfortunately, I don't see this one having as much of an interesting dynamic as the last two Marvel vs. DC fights. Ant-Man vs. Adam and Phoenix vs. Raven had at least had their own cool dynamics to play around with. But unless these two have some super crazy unique powers I'm not aware of besides shapeshifting, this will probably just end up being a lot of punching with a little bit of shapeshifting. I am open to being wrong though. If this episode ends up being amazing, another 10 out of 10 masterpiece, then I will happily eat my words on these claims, because you know what, this probably does have potential, I'm just not seeing it. Anyways, that's all from me. Thank you all so much for watching, and also, thank you all so much for supporting my latest Xenoverse video. I was not expecting that video to get as much traction as it did, especially not so quickly. But it's been out for like 5 days at the time of me writing this, and it's already at like 1.6 thousand views. So thank you guys so much for supporting that video, because it's honestly one of my favorite things I've made for this channel. And also check out some of my other non-Death Battle videos while you're at it, because honestly, I have a lot of fun making them. Anyways, that's all from me. I'll catch you guys later.